the Lukovskys, Denise was born a Lukovsky, that were part of a very, very strong Jewish community in Johannesburg, and many people who had fled Europe came to Johannesburg. I guess the clearest memory I have is of her and Robert Scott-Browne arriving at her father's very large, white, Adolf Loos-like house, set in a huge pine forest, surrounded by a white wall, in the heart of Johannesburg. And they had invited us, I think. I must have been 6 or 7 years old. And her then husband, Robert Scott-Browne, had done a joint architecture thesis with my father. And we arrived in my father's Citroen Light 15, and they arrived in an MG Magnette. And Denise was dressed in grey, that kind of pencil skirt that she favoured. And she had this shock of auburn hair which came out like this. I thought she was the most stylish thing I'd ever seen. But if I go through the books that they had and that they shared when they were students at university, I find things like McCall's Book of Houses. I find any number of books which are about the popular culture of design in the United States. And then she moved to UCLA and developed, she says, an interest in Los Angeles and Las Vegas because of being on the West Coast. And she invited Robert Venturi to visit her classes at UCLA, and in 1966, quote unquote, I asked him to visit Las Vegas with me. And so in July 23, 1967, they got married. Robert Venturi loomed up into our lives as students with complexity and contradiction. And then when I was studying at the AA, they came to give a lecture immediately after publishing Learning from Las Vegas. Anyway, they had a packed audience, and I knew I was going to go and have a meal with them afterwards as a humble student, but I was being invited. But they started this lecture, and it was the weirdest lecture I've ever attended, because a slide would come up, and then another slide would come up, and then it would say yes, and then it would say no, and then another slide would come up, and another slide would come up, and then it would go tick, and it would go cross. And they basically went for an hour just doing this with barely saying anything. And just when you looked at it afterwards, one side was all decorated sheds and the other side was all ducks. And at the end, nobody knew how to ask any questions or anything, and all just trooped out. There's no doubt in Denise's mind about who initiated that studio. And in fact, if you look at the facts, I mean, she's running an urban design program, she's organizing studios, she's doing all of this stuff. Quite clearly, this was something that really interested her. And in my mind, talking to them, there's never been any doubt that complexity and contradiction is fundamentally Robert's scholarship, but Las Vegas is very much Denise's scholarship, and it's at the core of her career in urban design. In Howard Raggatt's master's, he wanted to use the Vanna Venturi house as the model for this. He must have asked me to write to them and get permission for him to do something to the image, and we must have got a reply saying yes. And then Denise writes to me telling us what Bob thought about this design. And he found it very intriguing and exciting, but he obviously had read the whole of Howard's agonized writing during this period, and he basically said to him, relax, it's wonderful to be at the edge, and yes, it's marvelous that you misinterpret things, and keep going. So there was a certain kindred spirit and support that came from that.
I lived in Service Paradise from 57 through 62 when I came back down to Melbourne to finish high school. So it was like living in a holiday camp. It was a wonderful place to grow up in, and the surf was terrific. Spent a lot of time on a surfboard. And we used to go down to the Service Paradise Hotel beer garden when we were quite young, certainly well below the 21-year-old drinking age. and we'd watch the Bee Gees perform in the beer garden. And they must have been about 12 or 13 or something at the time. Cute little kids in special, what were called jerkins at that time, made, handmade by their mother. I first encountered learning from Las Vegas when I saw extracts in magazine articles of parts of it, but it wasn't until 1972 that I read the whole thing.
It was a bit like a bombshell because it was the first fundamental reappraisal of what we were brought up to think was really dumb, bad, everyday architecture.
Well, I read God's Own Junkyard soon after it was published in 1964. Interestingly, it was published 4 years after The Australian Ugliness. So Boyd got there first. And it was in 1971 when Peter Blake came here and spoke that he backtracked from all of that and said that he had rethought that, and he thought that there was something about popular culture that was legitimate and could be incorporated into architecture and urbanism.
It's interesting that Venturi and Scott Brown actually took Blake's imagery.
He took the Long Island duck
Right, okay.
from Peter Blake. Well, after all the planning in 1973, we set the time for the field trip in early January of 74.
I first saw the actual Ed Ruscha books in Los Angeles in about 1975, I think. But what struck me was the sheer bravado of, and both the conceptual nature of saying, let's photograph every building on Sunset Strip and Hollywood Boulevard subsequently. And it wasn't so much the actual execution, which was pretty rough, but simply the concept of doing it. As it happened, Tony and I had already been doing the same thing without particularly knowing about the Ruscha stuff. We had done the whole of Gold Coast Highway in an identical manner with identical equipment.
The Venturis, I think, took Las Vegas as a particularly rampant and free market form of urban development. And I thought the closest that we had here in Australia was Service Paradise. We did all of the field work, and John went back to Melbourne.
I got all the film processed and proofed and sent the proofs up to Tony.
That's right.
Who then took them to Los Angeles and sat on them for the next 20 years. Subsequently, as I was going up doing commercial work in Service Paradise, I realised that virtually every building I'd photographed and every street and road alignment had disappeared or been fundamentally changed. And since I still had all the original cameras and lenses, it just occurred to me that I could do a rephotography survey of my own work, thereby making a quite strong critique of the way modern architects and urban planners had actually developed Surface Paradise.
I was lucky enough to do a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in 1979, and when I arrived it was a very interesting school. They had modernists in one corner and the disciples of Cain in another, and in the third corner were the Venturis. And I was lucky enough to be one of the 15 students involved in that studio with Steve and Izenour. And for the next 10 or 12 weeks, we used the learnings from the Las Vegas studio to undertake a similar study in Atlantic City with Izenour. So this was looking at the way buildings communicated, the signs and symbols, not of the strip, but of the boardwalk. So the work that we undertook down at Atlantic City, and it was all field work, so we did the same thing that they'd done at Las Vegas. We mapped and photographed the vistas down the street, the sort of big scale, medium scale, and small scale of the signage, and Denise Styant-Browne was part of that as well, and Bob was a sort of a critic, because we did a lot of the work in their office. Well, about 2 weeks into the studio, Steve Izenour tapped me on the shoulder and he offered me a part-time job in the Venturi office, working on a whole range of projects, competitions, They were just finishing the ISI building in Philadelphia. But it was a very small office, I remember it being very, had a sort of messy vitality about it. And there were samples and drawings and models all over the office. One weekend, working in the office, and Bob pulled up at the desk next to mine and drew up plan sections and elevations of a house in a morning, and it was very amazing to watch him work. But he was a terrific mentor for all of us, all of the young people in the office, and worked with Bob on a series of chairs for the Knoll Furniture Company. So we made hundreds and hundreds of foam core models of these chairs. So that was a terrific thing to work directly with him on. So I went to work in their newly established New York office, exclusively on the Westway project, and Bob and Denise would come up for a day every week to work with three of us on that project. So again, that was a very special time that we had with them, learning about this sort of large-scale urbanism. In our more recent work with the Lyons practice, there were people who study our early projects up through to the sort of early 2000s. We'll see that there's a very clear connection to the work of the Venturis. The Sunshine Hospital, that has a direct relationship to learning from Las Vegas, and the site for that was adjacent to the newly completed Ring Road, Western Ring Road, and we used to go out there on weekends to photograph the site through the front windscreen of the car, as Izenour and we had done it at Atlantic City, and this was a building that we designed very much from the view from the freeway. So it has bright yellow brickwork at a sort of billboard scale, and then it has progressively smaller middle scale and small scale as you approach the building. So applying very directly those learnings from the Venturis. Probably one of our most well-known works, which was completed shortly after Sunshine Hospital, was the online training centre at Victoria University, where we used digitally printed panels to create the facade of this building used for computer training. And this was the content of it was about digital depth and in a way relating to the program of the building. We would correspond with Bob and Steve over the years, and he was always interested to receive a portfolio of drawings and photographs from our office, and he was always very generous at writing back and spurring us on. Even in our later buildings, where we have a much broader range of interests, I think now we can still see that thread, albeit very thin, winding its way back to the Venturis. And I think we and many people in Melbourne owe them an enormous debt.
When I saw the big book, it must have been like 74, 75. It was absolute thunderbolt to see it. Here was a authoritative research-based document that also said, no, you can look at your own material, you can look at this stuff that they all say is horrible, God's own junkyard, and say, actually, there's something here.
It gave that, as you're saying, that kind of localised analysis where we could start looking at where we were again, instead of always referring to somewhere in France or somewhere in, somewhere, God help us, somewhere else, always somewhere else where wonderful things were done.
We're just not good enough.
We
were not good enough.
Done. And we're happy to acknowledge wonderful things elsewhere, but, we needed to find a way to do work here.
I got a project to build a house for my sister in Adelaide while I was living in Melbourne in the early 80s. And that project did bear quite a bit of resemblance to the propositions that Venturi put out.
By the time we got to Kronborg, there was this idea of the kind of translated copy. The next step was to use the photocopier. So, and there was a whole digital shift. And so we could look for an analysis, if you like, or a exegesis maybe, of things like Venturi House. And under the copier, moving the copy, as it goes, seemingly stretching it, and then reprocessing that through digital processes to come up with this sort of pixelated, stretched version of it that you see built. And along with that, I guess there was this notion of pushing Venturi's influence to an extreme position.
Through an operational.
Yeah.
Actually,
especially through this kind of, we didn't do anything.
Yeah.
You know, we just stood back and
the machine did it all.
The machine did it all, which was a nice foil.
Taken to another extreme 20 years later by Greg Lynn when he's operated on the rubber duck to create remarkable outcomes.
For us, it went to things like Story Hall. So although Story Hall kind of doesn't look like it has anything to do with Venturi, really it is an essay in decoration.
He understood the whole history of creativity is about quotation. But I think it's important to differentiate between Venturi and Pomo.
Yeah, I think so. I think they've got much to do with each other.
The Marion project is really the idea of the big word. So it's the billboard plundering areas of art, essentially a sort of a speed blur of a word coming up to the roadside. Everything's a road trip. That's a pure Venturi technique.
The National Museum, for instance, is covered with text. I mean, it's done in Braille, but it's covered in text, which is clearly the whole decorated shed, and it shifts between decorated shed and duck.
That blurring too of is it the shed or is it the duck, and oscillating between the two constantly.
The portrait building that we're just building now creates a huge face of an Aboriginal elder looking down Swanston Street. It's almost inconceivable without Venturi, that notion of a building carrying that scale of image. It's deeply Venturian.
In the face in St Kilda is a kind of decorated apartment building where the facade is explicitly applied, and you approach it from the west and you can see, oh, okay, that's the facade, and you can see the framing. So it's actually clearly living behind a billboard. I mean, the whole thing about it being Dali's Sleep and Fairgrounds and Koolhaas's proposition about Coney Island and all that sort of thing imbued into one very simple gesture. And I think there's quite a lot more correlation between Koolhaas and Venturi than people give credit to. On that house that he did in Paris, which has to be a pastiche. If Venturi had grown up in Rotterdam, he would have done that house. It's a... Isn't it like you look at it and go, oh, come on. Anyway, Koolhaas and Venturi are like that.
To be truthful, I can't really remember exactly when I read Learning from Las Vegas, but I think I personally loved some of the essays that were at the end of that, and the strident way that they would advocate the sort of new position. I thought that was quite invigorating. When Howard and Steve Ashton were together, before they formed into Ashton, Raggatt, McDougall, they used some of the strategies, I think, that were articulated. Venturi and Denise Brown were setting up an argument where the decorated shed was the much more relevant building than the duck. That we do seem to sort of operate between the two.
I think Templestowe Park Primary School is definitely the shed. And if you look at our projects, probably the Kleinbottle House and the Cloud House would be ducks.
They are actually the pop object. That's what we're interested in. So the Cloud House, occupying a cloud, or the Kleinbottle House, the idea that you could occupy this object. They're self-consciously ducks, if you know what I mean.
And then probably a lot of the other projects are somewhere, on the scale in between. I
think that we probably agree with them that the strategy, of the decorated shed is probably, 75% of your buildings, I suppose, because it's so sort of accepting of the sort of economic conditions we have to work in. But every so often you do get the opportunity to do a sort of a duck, a kind of a duck. And
you grab it.
Like Deb said, we have really clear decorated sheds like Templestowe Park Primary School, where it's just a billboard on a space that was described out for a particular function, or the Yardmasters, which is really just a box, has all sorts
decorated.
of functions inside. And
it's a tissue box.
The decorated sheds, I suppose, are different to the sort of decorated sheds that they were actually articulating, because, theirs was a critique of overblown modernism. And I think, in a way, Venturi and Denise Brown described their buildings were very much about, I guess, reiterating their position very clearly. So the idea of it being a dumb box with the billboard was always clearly expressed in their buildings. Probably the closest one that comes to that position is probably the letterbox house, perhaps, where it is a pretty banal box on one side, but the way it has this sort of front which is really a side, which is scooped out of it, and that's
where all the action happens.
Yeah, but so it does have that sense of the ordinary and the extraordinary element. The frontage to the street is tiny; it's the letterbox, and the big piece of expression actually faces back onto the side. So, and instead of it is a billboard, but it's not a billboard that's attached; it's a billboard that's carved out of the building. On the one hand, it uses strategies that we couldn't have used if it wasn't for
knowledge
Las Vegas
of those, knowledge of those theories.
But on the other hand, it's completely contrary to some of their positions, I suppose. So that's why I think we see ourselves as not being, or being very, maybe some poor disciples of Venturi and Denise Scott-Browne. We take their techniques, but then we could be accused on occasions of doing things that they would not advocate. I read somewhere that the junior boys' school, Pallian Grammar, is described as postmodern, which is, I think, quite a good description. It is a billboard, but it's a billboard with it's completely blank. Maybe it's posed there waiting for someone to think of what to put on it. And then when you go inside, it's a completely different experience. So the inside experience doesn't seem to have anything that's related to the billboard or necessarily to the extrusion. It's just a completely different sense of what the space might be.
In fact, it has 5 facades, because we definitely did think of that from an aeroplane as well, flying over.
There were a significance for A&P parking lots, I think came out in Perspecta, the Yale Architectural Journal, probably 67 or 68. And there was a precursor studio to Learning from Las Vegas called Mass Communication on the People Freeway, which was written by Denise Scott-Browne, and that came out in Perspecta, which was Yale's architectural journal, again well before Learning from Las Vegas was published. So in other words, the Learning from Las Vegas studio actually comes after at least 2 related studios that the Venturis had held at Yale. And the book comes after another couple of exhibitions, such as Signs of Life of 1970, in which, once again, they'd been exploring suburban settings and looking for the order and patterning and the patterns of communication and the modes of communication that you encounter in suburbs. So, in other words, there is a background to Learning from Las Vegas. There was Learning from Levittown as well. There were a series of studios. Co-op City, Learning to Like It. In 1967, Peter Corrigan had written to Robin Boyd, and he'd asked Robin Boyd what his opinion was of Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which had come out in book form in 1966. And Robin Boyd wrote back and said he admired the book greatly. He really liked a lot of the things that Venturi had said in it. Now, this would horrify many people who'd identify with Robin Boyd or who would see themselves as going along the same path as Robin Boyd in Australia. That would probably horrify them. But this is what he wrote in this letter to Peter Corrigan. He added that at the end he noticed that there were a series of Robert Venturi designs printed out as well, very modestly, as he put it, referring to the micro format in which they appeared, little contact prints and tiny drawings, with, as he said, good reason for modesty. So I think there was a gap between what Robert Venturi was saying and what Robin Boyd thought about Robert Venturi's architecture. There was, subsequent to that, signs of a real shift in Robin Boyd's outlook as he began to explore what it was that Venturi architecture might be offering. But you do have the interesting instance of the fishbowl. This did create a reaction in Australia when people said, "Ooh, it looks like pop architecture," or "It looks like exactly the sort of thing he'd been complaining about in the Australian ugliness." I think Peter Corrigan's arrival at RMIT and the commencement of his work as an architect in collaboration with Maggie Edmond in the 1970s also reinforced the idea that you could really get an impressive background in training in the United States and bring it back and use it with telling effect here. Peter Corrigan particularly, between 1964 and 1967, had largely worked out and developed an inclusive, pluralist, complex and contradictory architecture on his own terms, without particular or without terribly specific recourse to the Venturis. There were some formal parallels, but I think they were worked out very much on his own terms. And when he was in the United States, he didn't actually study in the Learning from Las Vegas studio. He was doing a Master of Environmental Design at Yale. He would sit in on the Venturi's crits and on their analyses of student designs, but he wasn't one of their studio. And that's interesting, that in a sense he held himself distant to that extent.
We looked at the material for Learning from Las Vegas, and it's mostly 2D work. Photographs from their time in Las Vegas when as a studio. And I guess we wanted to bring a three-dimensional quality to the exhibition, perhaps, and leave the 2D work to speak for itself.
There's a series of ideas around the ordinary and the cheap, the phenomena and veneer, different ways of navigating, using the ground as a navigation surface, also using signs and symbols, and thinking about how we might also sort of think of the different exhibition spaces as almost being different parts of the city of Las Vegas. So thinking about approaching the exhibition through a long linear strip and projecting one of their films at the end of the space to kind of heighten this sense of, scale and the experience that they had of travelling in a car as they entered the city. And then sort of in another space, sort of focusing on lights and phenomena and using a lot of their films and projections to capture some of the quality, I guess, of what they were observing.
And I guess Las Vegas in the 60s was a very cheap and saturated place. It wasn't it didn't have the grand buildings that it has today. It didn't have all the money that I guess it has today. So a lot of the tactics that they used to build Las Vegas were things that we could readily put together for the exhibition in terms of using cheap and nasty ways to put the exhibition together.
Cheap and ordinary.
Cheap and ordinary, sorry. Decoration is cheaper, isn't it?
Decoration is cheaper. Yeah, we also went through the book and found quotes we really liked. So I liked the chapter called Billboards Are Almost All Right. And sort of that was an idea for the John Gollings part of the show upstairs, where he's kind of been marginalised to slightly the periphery of the exhibition, but that actually his show is like a billboard for the show downstairs. I liked this, the $10,000 stand with the $100,000 sign, and maybe that's what Las Vegas isn't anymore. Now it's an expensive building and the signage is kind of secondary, but we were sort of really interested in that in the exhibition.